Commander Alaric Voss stood at the edge of the shuttle, gazing down at the alien planet below. Its surface was rugged and barren, dotted with strange ruins that hinted at long-forgotten civilizations. The planet was an enigma, one that had stumped explorers for centuries. No one had dared set foot on it, except for the brave few who never returned. The legends spoke of a curse, of ancient powers waiting to be unleashed. Yet, Alaric wasn't one to believe in old stories. He was a soldier, a man of logic and action, not superstition. His mission was simple: to explore, uncover, and retrieve whatever valuable secrets this planet held. Beside him stood Aerith, a sharp-minded alien archaeologist whose knowledge of ancient ruins was unmatched. Aerith had spent her life studying alien artifacts, but even she couldn't explain the mystery surrounding this planet. Her bright purple eyes scanned the horizon, her brow furrowed with suspicion. She wasn't afraid, but she was cautious. The history of this planet didn't sit well with her, and her instincts told her something was off. "Commander," she spoke, her voice steady but with an underlying tension. "I've read the records. No one has ever come back from this planet. Not a single one." Alaric turned to her, a reassuring smile on his face. "We're not like the others. We'll succeed where they failed." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "We have to. The mission depends on it." The shuttle's engines hummed softly as it descended into the dense fog that blanketed the planet's surface. The crew aboard had been carefully selected. There was Sathan, a mercenary from the Sather species, whose strength and tenacity made him an ideal protector. Though he didn't always follow orders, his loyalty was unquestionable. Sathan had insisted on coming along for the promise of treasure and adventure. He had a reputation for always seeking the next big score. Alaric trusted him, but he kept a close eye on him nonetheless. As the shuttle touched down on the cold, rocky ground, the doors hissed open, and the crew stepped into the unknown. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ancient dust. The ruins stretched out before them like the remains of an old kingdom. Columns of stone stood like sentinels, guarding the secrets they held. But it was what lay beyond the ruins that truly intrigued Alaric: the legendary sword of Aethelmer. No one knew much about the sword, only that it was said to hold power unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It was a weapon from an ancient race, lost to time. The sword's power was rumored to grant the wielder unimaginable strength, the ability to conquer worlds. Many believed it was a myth, a fable passed down through generations. But Alaric wasn't here for the stories. He was here to uncover the truth. Aerith led the way, her holographic map displaying coordinates that seemed to pulse with life. She was hesitant at first, but the excitement of discovery soon overtook her caution. The deeper they ventured into the ruins, the more Alaric could feel it, a strange energy, as if something ancient was watching them. Sathan was the first to voice his thoughts. "We're not the only ones here," he said, scanning the area with his advanced equipment. "I'm picking up signs of activity. We're not alone." Alaric's grip tightened on his blaster. He knew danger was always lurking in the shadows, but they couldn't turn back now. They had come this far, and the sword was within reach. The crew pressed forward, their footsteps echoing through the long-forgotten halls. The excitement and uncertainty grew with every step. What would they find? Would the sword live up to its legend, or would they uncover something far more terrifying? As the group approached the heart of the ruins, the air grew colder, the ground beneath their feet cracked and uneven. They had reached the chamber. In the center of the room, resting on an ancient pedestal, was the sword. It glowed faintly in the dim light, as if it had been waiting for someone to claim it. Alaric's heart raced. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The stories, the legends, they were all real. But the question remained: would he be the one to lift it? The chamber was silent, save for the soft hum of the machinery hidden beneath the stone. The sword of Aethelmer lay before them, glowing with an eerie blue light. It was more beautiful than any of them had imagined, its blade shimmering with an ancient power, its hilt encrusted with precious jewels that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their hearts. For a moment, Alaric and his crew stood frozen, captivated by the sight of the sword. "This is it," whispered Aerith, her voice barely audible. Her wide, purple eyes locked on the sword. The legends were true. Alaric stepped forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor. His mission had brought him here, but now, standing in front of the legendary weapon, a part of him hesitated. The sword seemed to beckon him, a lure that promised power, something every warrior craved. His fingers twitched, itching to grip the hilt, but his mind warned him to be cautious. There was something in the air, a sense of dread that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a key to something far greater. "Stay focused," Alaric said, turning to the rest of the crew. His voice was steady, but inside, uncertainty gnawed at him. "We came for answers, not just the sword. Let's make sure we understand what we're dealing with first." Sathan, the mercenary with a reputation for seeking treasure at any cost, was already stepping toward the pedestal, his eyes greedy with anticipation. He could barely contain himself. "Answers?" Sathan laughed. "This is the answer. Grab the sword, and let's get out of here. There's fortune waiting for us." "Wait," Aerith called out, her tone sharp. "There's something wrong. I don't trust this place." Alaric shared her concern. The room had an unnatural stillness, as though the air itself was thick with the weight of time and forgotten histories. He glanced at Sathan, who was now standing just a few feet from the sword. "Sathan, don't be reckless." But Sathan ignored him. His gloved hand reached out, fingers brushing the hilt of the sword. The moment his fingers touched it, a sudden surge of energy rippled through the room. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows along the stone walls. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Alaric could hear the low hum of an ancient mechanism coming to life. The air grew heavy, pressing down on them. "Sathan!" Aerith shouted, her voice filled with panic. The mercenary staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face twisted in agony as he tried to tear his hand away from the sword, but it was as if the weapon had a life of its own, gripping him with an unrelenting force. Alaric rushed forward, grabbing Sathan by the shoulder and pulling him away. The mercenary let out a strangled gasp, but Alaric barely noticed as he dragged him back. They collapsed onto the floor, and Alaric quickly checked Sathan for injuries. To his surprise, Sathan was unscathed, but his face was pale, his breath shallow. "What happened?" Alaric asked, his voice tight with worry. Sathan stared at him, eyes wide with terror. It was like the sword was pulling me in. "I couldn't control myself. It's cursed, Alaric. There's power in that thing. And it's not a power we should be messing with." Aerith was already examining the pedestal, her mind racing. "This sword, it's not just a weapon. It's an ancient trial. The stories, they mention it. Only one who proves themselves worthy can wield it. It's not just about strength. It's about what lies inside the person who tries to take it." Alaric frowned, glancing once more at the sword. He'd come for answers, but now he was more confused than ever. The idea of trials and tests, who decided who was worthy? What kind of power was contained within the sword? And what would it take to pass its test? Before he could speak, a distant rumble echoed through the chamber. The walls began to shift, as though the room itself was alive, reacting to their presence. The floor cracked, revealing the hidden passageway that had been sealed for centuries. "What is that?" Aerith asked, stepping back from the pedestal. Alaric motioned for the crew to stay alert. "I don't know, but it looks like the sword is leading us somewhere." They had no choice but to follow. They'd come this far, and the sword's power was still calling to them. The only question was, who among them would be the one to face the trial next, and would they survive? The hidden passageway stretched out before them, dark and narrow. The walls of the chamber had moved silently, revealing the entrance to what appeared to be a long-forgotten tunnel. The air was thick with dust and an unsettling stillness that sent chills down their spines. Alaric glanced at his crew, their faces tense but determined. They had no choice but to follow the trail the sword had revealed. The planet seemed to be alive with secrets, and they were on the cusp of uncovering them. "Stay close," Alaric ordered, his voice low but firm. He activated his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness ahead. Aerith followed closely behind him, her eyes scanning every shadow, her mind racing with the possibilities. Sathan, still shaken but unwilling to be left behind, trailed behind her, his hand resting on the hilt of his blaster. He was ready for anything, though his usual bravado had dimmed after the encounter with the sword. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for them to walk single file. The floor was uneven, with jagged rocks protruding from the stone. Alaric's footsteps echoed, a reminder that they were far from the safety of their ship. Each step felt like they were descending deeper into the unknown, and the weight of what lay ahead grew heavier with each passing moment. "I don't like this," Sathan muttered, his voice barely audible in the silence. "This place doesn't feel right. It's like we're not supposed to be here." Aerith gave him a quick glance, her eyes sharp. "This planet was abandoned for a reason," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that gripped them all. "But we're not the first to come here. There's a reason the sword called us. We have to understand it. We have no choice now." Alaric nodded, agreeing with her words. They couldn't turn back. The sword, the power it promised, it was too important. And now, they were entangled in something much larger than any of them had anticipated. As they pressed forward, the air grew colder. It was as if the deeper they went into the tunnel, the more the planet itself was trying to resist their presence. The faint sound of running water echoed through the passage, but when they looked around, there was nothing, just the dark stone walls, slick with moisture. The sense of being watched grew stronger, like unseen eyes were tracking their every move. "We're getting close," Alaric murmured, his eyes fixed ahead. The beam of his flashlight fell on something ahead in the darkness, an archway, carved from stone, that led into another chamber. The markings on the walls around it were unlike anything he had seen before. Symbols, glowing faintly with an eerie light, seemed to shift and move as if they were alive. Alaric's pulse quickened. There was something almost hypnotic about the way the symbols twisted, as if they were telling a story of their own, one that had been buried for centuries. Sathan's hand tightened around his weapon, but Alaric raised a hand to stop him. "Stay calm. We're not here to fight. We need answers." They approached the archway cautiously, each step reverberating in the silence. When they crossed the threshold, they entered a vast chamber. The walls were lined with towering statues, each one frozen in time, their eyes set in an eternal gaze toward the center of the room. In the middle of the chamber stood a pedestal, much like the one they had seen earlier. But this time, there was no sword. Instead, there was a small stone basin, filled with a strange liquid that shimmered with an iridescent glow. Aerith stepped forward, her curiosity piqued. "What is this?" she whispered. Her eyes narrowed as she examined the liquid, her hands hovering just above it. Alaric moved closer to her, his gaze still wary. "It could be a trap. Whatever it is, don't touch it." But as soon as Aerith spoke those words, the chamber seemed to come alive. The statues around them shifted, their stone faces coming to life with an eerie glow in their eyes. The air hummed, vibrating with energy. The floor beneath them trembled, and an ancient voice echoed through the chamber, its source impossible to pinpoint. The voice was deep, ancient, and filled with authority. It seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating in the very stone of the room. Alaric's heart raced as he scanned the room, looking for the source of the voice. "We seek the sword of Aethelmer," he called out, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up on him. The statue's eyes blazed with light as the voice responded. "Only those who prove themselves worthy may claim the sword. But beware, Only one may succeed. Fail, and you will become part of this eternal place. The air grew heavier, and Alaric knew they had reached the heart of the trial. The sword was within reach, but now they had to face whatever challenge awaited them. Would they succeed, or would they too become trapped within the ancient power of Aethelmer? The air in the chamber thickened, vibrating with an ancient power that seemed to press against them from all sides. Alaric stood at the forefront, his mind racing. The voice of Aethelmer had spoken, and the challenge was clear. There would be no easy victory here. The weight of the trial hung heavy in the air, and Alaric could feel his pulse quicken. He could sense the presence of the sword of Aethelmer, just beyond the pedestal, but it remained out of reach, guarded by the unknown forces of this ancient place. "We need to stay focused," Alaric said, turning to his crew. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency in it. They had come this far, and now there was no turning back. They had to prove their worth. Aerith, standing beside him, nodded in agreement. Her brow was furrowed, her eyes scanning the chamber for any clues that might help them. "The challenge isn't just about strength," she said, her voice low. "It's about something more, something we need to figure out." Sathan, ever the skeptic, grunted. "Great. Another puzzle. I was hoping for something more direct." He kept his hand close to the blaster at his side, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be an ordinary fight. The chamber seemed to pulse with energy as the statues of ancient warriors, once silent, now seemed to stir. Their stone forms shifted slightly, their eyes glowing brighter. It was as though the room itself was alive, watching them, waiting for the first move. The air was heavy with expectation, and for a moment, no one spoke. It was as if the chamber had a heartbeat of its own. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. A low rumble echoed throughout the chamber, reverberating off the stone walls. Alaric's eyes widened as the pedestal began to sink slowly into the floor, revealing the hidden passage beneath it. The passageway was dark, shrouded in mystery, its depths impossible to see. "What is this?" Sathan asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and caution. "Some kind of hidden test." Alaric nodded slowly. "It's part of the trial. This is where the real test begins." Aerith stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Then let's face it head on." Without another word, she was the first to move, stepping cautiously toward the newly revealed passage. Alaric and Sathan followed closely behind, the weight of the trial heavy on their shoulders. The walls of the passage were lined with strange carvings, their meaning elusive. The air was thick with the scent of ancient dust, and the stone beneath their feet felt slick and unstable. As they moved deeper, the passage seemed to narrow, forcing them into single file. "What is it you seek, travelers?" The voice of Aethelmer echoed once again, its tone powerful and commanding. "To claim the sword, you must first face the trials of the past. You must prove your worthiness by overcoming the darkness within." The words hung in the air, their meaning unclear but undeniably important. Alaric's heart raced as he realized that this was no ordinary test. The challenge before them was not just physical. It was mental, emotional, and perhaps even spiritual. They would have to confront something deep within themselves to move forward. They reached the end of the passage, where a large chamber opened up before them. In the center of the room stood a tall stone altar, bathed in a soft, otherworldly light. The sword of Aethelmer lay there, its blade glowing faintly, as if calling to them. But as they stepped forward, the ground beneath them suddenly gave way. Alaric barely had time to react as he fell, tumbling into darkness. His crew's voices echoed in the distance, but the darkness swallowed them all. The fall seemed to last forever, but eventually they landed with a thud, the impact rattling their bones. They were in a new chamber now, one even darker and more foreboding than the last. The walls here were slick with a strange substance, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. They were no longer alone. Strange, shadowy figures moved in the corners of the room, their forms barely visible in the darkness. "Who dares disturb the resting place of Aethelmore?" A voice hissed from the shadows, its tone cold and mocking. Alaric's heart pounded in his chest, but he knew one thing for certain. This was the real trial. To claim the sword, they would have to face these phantoms, these remnants of a time long past. They would have to confront their deepest fears and darkest memories. He looked at Aerith and Sathan, their faces set with determination. This was their moment. They had come too far to turn back now. The shadowy figures shifted closer, their eyes glowing with malice. The trial had truly begun, and only one thing was certain. They would need to give everything they had to survive it. The darkness of the chamber seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing everything in sight. Alaric's heart pounded in his chest as the shadowy figures crept closer. Their glowing eyes pierced through the blackness, each pair full of silent malice. The air was thick with tension, and a cold chill ran down his spine. These weren't just illusions. They were real. These were the trials of Aethelmore, and there was no turning back now. "Stay together," Alaric whispered to his team. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. "We can't fight them alone." Aerith stepped forward, her expression calm, though her fingers tightened around her blaster. "We'll face them together. We've come this far, haven't we?" Her eyes flicked to the shadowy figures, calculating, waiting for the first move. Sathan scowled, his hand instinctively reaching for his own weapon, but he was cautious. "There's something off about this place. It's not just physical strength we need to get through. It's more than that." Alaric nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Aethelmore's trials aren't meant to be conquered with violence alone." The shadows loomed, shifting in unnatural ways as though they were a part of the very darkness around them. The closer they came, the colder the air became, pressing in on them from all sides. Without warning, one of the figures lunged forward. It moved with speed and precision, like a phantom of the night. Aerith's blaster shot fired before she even fully processed the movement, but the shadows seemed to melt into the air, evading the blast with ease. "Damn it," Aerith muttered, lowering her weapon. "They're not like anything we've seen." Alaric's mind raced. These shadows weren't just fighters. They were reflections of the fear and uncertainty that lay deep inside each of them. The more they fought, the more these phantoms would grow. The trial would never end unless they faced what these shadows represented. Suddenly, a cold voice broke through the silence, sending a shiver down Alaric's spine. "To claim the sword, you must first claim your own heart." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in the dark chamber, its meaning unclear. But Alaric understood. This was the trial. They weren't just fighting for a sword. They were fighting for their own souls. The shadows began to close in around them, and Alaric could feel his breath growing heavier. The figures weren't just attacking. They were toying with them, forcing them to confront the very fears that had followed them all their lives. Alaric could see flashes of his past in the darkness. The Cold War, the battles, the loss of friends. Aerith's haunted expression told him she was fighting her own ghosts, and Sathan, his face twisted in anger, was clearly confronting his past failures. Alaric shook his head. "Focus," he muttered. He couldn't afford to get lost in the past. They needed to move forward together. His hands clenched into fists. "We're stronger than this." With renewed determination, Alaric stepped toward the nearest shadow. As he did, the shadow began to shift, taking the shape of a figure he recognized. A man he'd once fought beside, a friend who had fallen in battle. The ghostly figure smiled at him with sad, knowing eyes. "Why didn't you save me, Alaric?" the figure asked, its voice like a whisper in his ear. Alaric's chest tightened, and for a moment, he hesitated. The guilt, the doubt, it all rushed back, and he almost stumbled. But then he heard Irith's voice cut through the darkness. "Don't listen to them," she shouted. "They're not real." Her words were a lifeline. Alaric breathed out slowly, forcing the doubt aside. He wasn't the man he used to be. He'd learned, he'd grown. He couldn't let the shadows control him. With a forceful step, Alaric reached forward and grabbed the shadowy figure by the shoulder. The illusion flickered and vanished, leaving only the cold, empty air behind. "Let's go," Alaric said, his voice strong. "We can't let them break us." Aerith and Sathan, fighting their own battles, turned toward him with renewed determination. The shadows had not yet been defeated, but the trio now understood the real challenge. It was not about fighting them with weapons, but about overcoming the darkness inside themselves. Each shadow they destroyed was one step closer to the sword and to their own redemption. With a final, decisive move, they pushed forward. The shadowy figures scattered in all directions, but Alaric and his crew knew that the path forward would not be easy. They were on the verge of something great, but the final test was yet to come. The sword called to them, its power now within reach, but only if they could survive the rest of Aethelmer's trial. Alaric's heart raced as the group pressed forward, their path winding through the ancient, forgotten hallways of Aethelmer's temple. Every step they took seemed to echo through the stone, like the chambers themselves were alive, watching their every move. The shadows they'd faced were gone for now, but Alaric knew the trial was far from over. The sword was closer, but so was the danger. Aerith was the first to speak, breaking the silence that had enveloped them. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice low. She glanced around nervously, as if sensing something Alaric could not. "What do you mean?" Alaric asked, tightening his grip on his sword. The weight of it felt strange now, heavy with the promise of something more than just the weapon itself. "The air, its change." Aerith's eyes narrowed as she scanned the dark corridors ahead. "Something's waiting for us." Sathan, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "You're imagining things. There's nothing here except the sword." But Alaric wasn't so sure. He could feel it too. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, like the very walls were pressing in on them. It wasn't just the atmosphere. It was the power of the temple itself. Aethelmer's trials were never meant to be simple tests. They were designed to break those who weren't worthy of the power within. As they reached the end of the hallway, they came upon a massive chamber, larger than any they had seen before. In the center, a pedestal stood, bathed in a soft, almost otherworldly light. On it rested the ancient sword, the one that had called to them, the one that no alien had been able to lift before. Alaric's breath caught in his throat. The sword was even more magnificent than he'd imagined, its blade gleaming with a strange, ethereal glow. It was as though the sword was waiting for something, or someone, to claim it. "This is it," Sathan murmured, stepping forward. But as he approached, a low rumble echoed through the chamber, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. Aerith grabbed onto Alaric's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" Alaric's instincts kicked in. "Stay back," he ordered, his eyes locked on the sword, realizing the danger too late. A surge of energy shot through the room, and the air shimmered with unseen forces. Alaric could feel it, the power of the sword calling out, testing them. It was more than just a weapon. It was a test of their worthiness. The pedestal began to rise from the ground, lifting the sword into the air. The light around it intensified, blinding them momentarily. As the light dimmed, the sword hovered above the pedestal, surrounded by a swirling vortex of energy. Alaric's heart pounded as the realization hit him. They weren't just facing a trial of strength. This was a trial of heart. A booming voice filled the chamber, echoing with authority. "Only one may claim the sword. Only one may wield the power of Aethelmer. Prove your worth, or perish." The challenge was clear. They had to prove themselves, not just in battle, but in their very souls. The sword wouldn't be claimed by just anyone. It would choose the one it deemed worthy, the one who could truly unlock its power. The stakes had never been higher. Sathan clenched his fists. I'm not afraid of a test. We've come this far. There's no turning back. Aerith, however, remained silent, her brow furrowed in deep thought. She had always been the practical one, the strategist. She wasn't sure what this test would ask of them, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Alaric took a step forward, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't just here for the sword, he was here for something more. He needed to prove not just to Ethelmer, but to himself that he could carry the weight of what lay ahead. The trial had already taken everything from him, his doubts, his fears, but this was different. It was a chance to finally become something more than just a soldier. The swirling energy intensified, and a vision flashed before Alaric's eyes. He saw the faces of those he'd lost, the people he had failed to protect. They were the shadows that had haunted him, the weight of their memory pressing down on him like a crushing force. But then, something shifted. The vision began to fade, replaced by the faces of his companions, Aerith and Sathan. They were the future, the ones who had fought by his side, the ones who had believed in him when he could barely believe in himself. He wasn't alone. He couldn't let the past control him any longer. He had to prove to himself that he was worthy of this power, not just for his own sake, but for theirs as well. The voice boomed again, louder this time. Choose, warrior. Will you claim the sword and embrace the power, or will you let it slip through your fingers? Alaric stepped forward, his eyes locked on the sword. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with purpose. The moment had come. The air was thick with anticipation as Alaric stepped forward, his heart racing. The sword hovered in the center of the room, its glowing blade calling to him. The swirling vortex of energy around it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a force that tested everything Alaric had ever known. He could feel the weight of the trial pressing down on him, but this time, it wasn't just about strength or courage. This was a test of his heart, of his resolve. Could he rise to the challenge? Sathan stood at the edge of the chamber, watching with narrowed eyes. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides, but his expression betrayed uncertainty. He had always been the first to charge into a battle, but this was something different. The sword had called to Alaric, and now the power that emanated from it seemed to surround them all. Aerith remained silent, her gaze fixed on Alaric. She could sense the tension in the air, the gravity of the decision before him. It was one thing to be brave in battle, to fight with strength, but this was a different kind of battle. This was a fight within himself. She could only hope he was ready for it. Alaric's eyes never left the sword. He knew the trials of Ethelmer were legendary, designed to break the unworthy. He had seen others fail, watched them crumble under the weight of their own doubts. He had always believed that strength would be enough, that if he fought hard enough, he could overcome anything. But now, standing before the sword, he realized that it wasn't just strength he needed. It was something deeper. The voice boomed again, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Will you take the sword, Alaric? Will you embrace its power, or will you allow your fear to defeat you? Alaric's hand shook as he reached for the sword, but he did not pull away. The energy swirling around it seemed to test him, pushing against his will. He could feel the sword's power pulsing in the air, a power that seemed to offer everything, yet demanded everything in return. It was a temptation, a promise, but also a challenge. Could he control it? Could he wield it without becoming consumed by it? Alaric's thoughts raced as he stood before the sword. He had faced countless battles, but none like this. This wasn't a fight against an enemy, but a fight against himself. He had always been driven by a need to protect, to fight for others. But now he had to ask himself, what was he fighting for? What was worth this power? Sathan stepped forward, his voice breaking through the silence. You don't have to do this alone, Alaric, he said, his tone softer than usual. We're with you. You don't have to carry the weight of this decision by yourself. Aerith nodded in agreement, her eyes filled with understanding. You're not alone in this. We've all faced our own trials, but together, we can face anything. Alaric's heart swelled with gratitude. He had spent so much time thinking he had to bear everything alone, that his failures and burdens were his alone to carry. But now, as he looked at his companions, Sathan, Aerith, he realized that they had never been his burden. They were his strength. The sword seemed to respond, its glow intensifying, as if sensing the change in Alaric. The energy swirling around it shifted, calming, as if acknowledging his decision. The weight of the trial had not been in the sword, nor in the power it promised. The true trial had been in accepting that he was not alone, that the power within him was not just for his own gain, but for the protection of those he cared about. With a deep breath, Alaric reached out again, his hand steady this time. The sword responded immediately, the light surrounding it dimming to a soft, steady glow. The power didn't overwhelm him. Instead, it flowed into him, filling him with strength, purpose, and clarity. Alaric lifted the sword from its pedestal. The moment it was in his grasp, the room seemed to breathe with him, as if the entire temple had come alive. The sword was not just a weapon. It was a symbol, a beacon of what he had become. And in that moment, Alaric knew that he was ready for whatever lay ahead, not because of the sword, but because of the strength he had found within himself, and the friends who stood by his side. The voice, now softer, spoke again. "You have proven yourself worthy, Alaric. The sword is yours. But remember, true power lies not in the blade you hold, but in the choices you make." Alaric stood tall, the sword now a part of him. He was ready to face whatever the future held, because he knew he wasn't facing it alone. The sun rose over the distant hills, casting a warm golden light across the land. The air was filled with the promise of something new. Alaric stood atop the ancient stone steps of the temple, the sword now resting at his side. The weight of the blade was no longer a burden, but a symbol of his growth, his journey, and the friends who had stood beside him. The sword had tested him, but in the end, it had revealed his true strength. Not the strength of his arm, but the strength of his heart. He had learned that power, true power, was not about dominance or control. It was about the choices one made, the sacrifices one was willing to endure, and the courage to stand for what was right. Beside him, Sathan looked out across the vast landscape, his expression thoughtful. He had always been the first to rush into battle, quick to take action and act without hesitation. But now, standing next to Alaric, he understood the weight of the decisions they had made. The trials had not only tested Alaric, they had tested them all. Each of them had faced their own fears, their own doubts. But together, they had come out stronger. Sathan knew that the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were ready to face whatever came next. Aerith stood just a few steps behind, her gaze focused on the horizon. The wind tugged at her cloak, but she remained still, her mind turning over the events that had led them to this point. She had always been the quiet one, the one who observed, who thought before acting. But even she had learned something from their journey. She had learned to trust, to believe in the power of unity, and to place her faith in those around her. They had all changed, in ways they hadn't even realized until now. "You've done it, Alaric," Sathan said, his voice full of respect. "The sword is yours. And with it, the future of Aethelmer." Alaric turned to face him, his expression calm but determined. "It's not just mine," he replied, his voice steady. "It belongs to all of us. We've all fought for this in our own ways." Aerith nodded, her eyes soft but filled with understanding. "We've all paid the price, but together, we've earned it. Now it's time to rebuild." The future of Aethelmer lay before them, filled with both challenges and opportunities. There were many who would test their resolve, who would seek to destroy the peace they had fought so hard to create. But Alaric knew that the strength of their bond was unbreakable. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, stronger than ever. As they descended the temple steps, Alaric couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising within him. The path ahead would not be easy, and there would be battles to fight, challenges to overcome. but they would face them together. The sword had given them power, but it was their unity, their trust in one another, that would see them through the darkest of times. They walked toward the village, where the people awaited their return. The sounds of the day, birds singing, the rustling of the trees, the distant chatter of the villagers, seemed to welcome them home. Alaric's heart swelled with a sense of belonging. They had fought not just for themselves, but for the future of their people. And now, they had a chance to shape that future, to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. As they approached the village, the villagers gathered, their faces alight with hope. The once dark days of fear and uncertainty were behind them. In their place was a new dawn, one that held the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The people cheered as Alaric and his companions walked into the village, their heads held high. They had returned as heroes, not just because of the sword they wielded, but because of the hearts they had shown. Alaric stood before the people, his hand resting on the sword at his side. "This is not just my victory," he said, his voice ringing out across the crowd. "It is all of ours. Together, we will rebuild. Together, we will face the future." And with those words, the future of Aethelmer began anew, filled with hope, strength, and unity. The dawn had come, and with it, a new chapter in their story. A story of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond that had carried them through every trial. And as Alaric stood there, surrounded by his friends and the people he had fought to protect, he knew one thing for sure. They were ready to face whatever the world had in store, together.